My name is Gordon Atkins. I've worked cases from missing persons to triple homicides, spent years chasing ghosts in alleys that reeked of gasoline and guilt. Lost my daughter in a car accident 7 years ago, when she was 8. My wife left 3 weeks later. I stayed, drowning in other people's tragedies so I didn't have to face my own. Then a new case came in. They told me the case was simple, a single victim, an identified suspect, and no media attention. A quiet job tucked away in the forgotten folds of the Midwest. I took it because it was far. Away from the city, the hospital, and the photographs still taped to my fridge. The moment I stepped off the bus, I regretted it. It wasn't the heat or the silence. It was the steady hum of the streetlights burning through the day, as if they'd forgotten how to sleep. The town was called Bellbrook. If you searched for it, you'd get a weather forecast and maybe a blurry image of the courthouse, but not much else. It didn't have a welcome sign, just a gas station at the edge with a clerk who watched me too long and spoke too little. The precinct was a 3-room shack posing as a police station, its siding peeled like sunburnt skin. Sheriff Holloway had white in his beard and red in his eyes. He greeted me like someone who hadn't had a full night's sleep in years. "I'll be honest," he said, sliding a case file across his desk. "I'm glad they sent someone from outside. People here don't ask the right questions anymore." The file smelled like rot. One victim, female, no signs of struggle, found in her home, door locked from inside, no visible wounds or signs of trauma, just an expression of terror stretched across her face like a second skin. "Cause of death?" I asked. He shrugged. "You ever see someone die of pure fear?" I didn't answer. I'd seen worse, or thought I had. That night, I stayed in the town's only motel. Carpet still smelled like the 70s. The mirror was cracked across the middle like it had tried to smile and failed. I didn't sleep. The case itself didn't keep me up. It was the silence, the kind that presses against your ears until your own heartbeat sounds like a threat. Morning came with fog that settled in the room itself. My breath misted the room, and I had to rub the mirror twice to see my own face. For a moment, I thought I saw something else staring back. Something about it was hesitant, like it wasn't ready. At the station, Holloway had left me a list. Without a heading or signature, just a crumpled sheet scrawled with strange instructions. The first one read, "Never speak to a witness twice. If you have to, change your questions." It felt procedural at first, until I realized some people here answered too easily, as if they'd rehearsed. The second rule warned, "Do not record in the chapel. Playback never matches reality." I raised a brow at that. What does that even mean? But the third chilled me more. If someone claimed they saw you when you know you weren't present, you needed to walk away. It felt like more than a procedural warning. It felt like a message. It assumed someone might wear my face. Check your reflection every morning. If it blinks out of sync, stay in the room. That one made me pause. Something about it felt delayed, like the mirror might know more than I did. The next was simpler, but somehow worse. When the church bell rings outside Sunday, don't speak to anyone until it stops. Something about it felt ritualistic. Do not trust photographs. That line was underlined twice. And the last, it read more like a warning than a rule. If you hear voices telling you things only you should know, run. No questions, no analysis. Run. At first, I thought it was a joke. Maybe the old sheriff's way of hazing the new blood. But when I opened the first victim's file again, tucked between the autopsy report and a birth certificate, I found a photo. It was of her, yes, but not just her. I was in the background, behind a window, staring in. I'd never met her. I'd never stepped foot in that house, not even driven past it. But there I was, half blurred behind the window pane, staring through the glass like a voyeur waiting for something unspeakable to happen. I leaned closer to the photo, hoping I was wrong, hoping it was a trick of light or a double exposure. But the coat was mine, the hairline. The expression was calm, eerily familiar, unsettling in a way that made my fingers tightened around the edge of the file, heart stuttering in my chest. Whoever or whatever had been there wasn't imitating me. It was taking my place. I folded the photo back into the file and walked out into the main office. Sheriff Holloway was at his desk, sipping something too dark to be coffee. "Did the last guy leave anything else behind?" I asked. He didn't look up. "Just the list." "And him? What happened to him?" "Walker? Took 2 days on the case, then walked into the woods behind the chapel and never came back. We searched for weeks. Dogs couldn't catch a scent. One tracker said it was like he'd vanished mid-step. I leaned against the wall, trying to understand what he'd just said. Vanished mid-step? I've seen officers go off-grid before, from burnout, guilt, fear. But disappearing like mist from a field? That wasn't something you explained with paperwork. And the woods, what could be back there? What did he see that made him keep walking? I wasn't afraid yet, but I was starting to realize I'd stepped into something that didn't want to be solved. I stared out the front window of the station. 2 locals passed by, a woman with stringy hair and a boy who looked too stiff to be tired. Their eyes flicked toward the station, then away, like looking too long might cost them something. Their faces had that pale, stretched quality of people holding in too much for too long. I stepped outside for a few minutes, letting the wind hit my face, trying to feel something real. The town had a way of smothering clarity. I walked aimlessly, boots scraping pavement, past closed shops with sun-faded signage and mannequins that hadn't changed clothes in years. A rusted swing creaked slowly in an empty park. The park stood abandoned, a place where children's voices had once echoed, but now only the slow sway of the swing offered a sign of life. I circled back without realizing, standing once again outside the station, unsure if I had moved at all. Back in my room that night, I sat on the bed, shoes still on. The silence was thicker now, almost humming. I rubbed my eyes, but when I closed them, Clara's face came up. It wasn't Clara as I remembered her. Something in the eyes, the posture, slightly off yet undeniably wrong. Too still, like a wax figure posing as a memory. "I'm sorry," I said aloud to the empty room. I wasn't there when it mattered. And when I was, I didn't know how to be. The motel creaked, but not from age or weather. It was as if the building itself inhaled and held it, like it was waiting for me to speak first. I sat frozen, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the ceiling as if a reply might echo back. The silence had a pressure to it, something sentient. It wasn't simply the absence of sound. The silence filled the space like a weight, pressing against skin and bone, insisting on being felt, reminding me that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I asked Holloway about the list. "Don't break them," he said without lifting his gaze. "You'll get a warning once. You won't get a second." His voice wasn't threatening, but there was something final in it, like a man who'd buried enough bodies to stop pretending rules were optional. I watched his eyes. He believed what he was saying. I wanted to push back, call it superstition, protocol gone weird, but part of me didn't. Part of me, the part that had stared at my own face in someone else's window, was already listening. He handed me a new copy, same handwriting, as if they were meant for me specifically, as if someone knew I'd need them. Outside, the town moved slowly. Faces repeated. A man walked past twice, wearing the same brown jacket, same limp 5 minutes apart. A woman stared at a mailbox, then laughed too loud at nothing at all. Every face seemed slightly unstitched from its expression, like a mask held too tight. I didn't talk to anyone. Not yet. Instead, I walked back to the victim's house. The door matched the one in the photo. The blinds hung at that same crooked angle, and an unease crept up my spine as if the building itself remembered me crawling up my neck. I didn't knock. I just stood there, breathing in a place I hadn't entered, but where my image had already arrived. The front door gave way with the kind of resistance that felt rehearsed, like the house didn't want to open but knew it had to. The air inside was dry, stale, and unmoving, like it hadn't been disturbed since the victim's last breath. A single photo frame still hung straight above the mantel. No dust disturbed, no marks on the floor. Every object was where it should be. Too much so. I walked the perimeter of the living room, each footstep feeling like it stepped over something unseen. The couch had a slight indent, as if someone had just risen from it. On the kitchen counter sat a cup of cold coffee, untouched but recent. In the bedroom, the bed was made. Sheets stretched tight. Nothing was overturned or broken, and the stillness had been shaped into something almost deliberate. It was the kind of quiet that refused to ease me, pressing in like a silent accusation. Everything in its place, but with a wrongness humming just beneath the surface. The scent of lavender drifted in faintly, like it was pumped through the walls, manufactured calm in the middle of something much darker. I touched the edge of a nightstand. The veneer was warm. I opened the closet. Empty, save for one thing, a cassette player. Old, dusty, but recently moved. I didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, I took photos, then paused, remembered the rule. Do not trust photographs. So I stood, committing every detail to memory. Each detail, each imperfection, absence of smudge where dust should have settled. This house wasn't abandoned. It had been prepared. For me? For someone like me? Outside, the sky had turned a shade dimmer, though the hour hadn't changed. Shadows stretched in unnatural directions. I stepped off the porch and nearly ran into an old man standing still on the sidewalk. "You're not from here," he said. His voice cracked like frost on glass. "No," I replied. He stared at the house behind me. "She didn't scream, did she?" "I don't know." He nodded like that confirmed something terrible. "Don't follow the bells," he said. Was that another rule? It wasn't on the paper, but it had the same weight, the same hush behind it. Maybe some of them weren't written down. Maybe some were spoken only once, meant to be remembered or forgotten at your own risk. I didn't ask again. I just held on to the words, wondering if I'd already broken something I didn't understand. Whispered, "What?" But he had already turned. I watched him shuffle away, coat fluttering despite the still air. I reached for my notebook to write it down, but couldn't recall the exact words he'd said. They slipped from memory like water from a cracked cup. The sun lowered but refused to touch the horizon. I made my way up a winding path toward the chapel, led less by direction and more by a tug in my ribs, like gravity knew something I didn't. The town's church stood on a hill, its steeple darkened with time. No cross at the top, no signboard, just old bricks and silence. The windows weren't stained glass, but shuttered wood, like it was trying to forget it ever served a congregation. I didn't go in, just stood near the door and set down my recorder. The wood beneath my boots felt soft, like moss had taken root even where there was none. When I hit play 10 minutes later, there was static, then footsteps, then something that sounded like a breath, and then, "Daddy?" My hand jerked. The recorder hit the ground. I replayed it, again and again, always the same. "Daddy?" It was Clara's voice, clear, steady, undeniably real, her tone uninterrupted by static or distortion, suspended in the air like a memory I never permitted to return. The cold moved inward then, wrapping fingers around my spine. I checked the recorder, rewound the tape. My name wasn't on it, no label, but it was mine. The sound was there, the voice. Heart pounding, I knelt to snatch up the recorder. My fingers fumbled as I shoved it back into my coat pocket, not even bothering to stop the tape. I stood up too fast, nearly losing my balance, eyes darting to the edges of the chapel, to the windows shuttered from within. I scanned the hill, the path below, searching for the old man, but he was gone. The silence pressed in, not empty but observant, and I felt the gaze of something that didn't need eyes. I moved, quick and clumsy, stumbling down the path toward the road. The gravel crunched louder than it should have. I didn't stop looking over my shoulder until the town swallowed the hill behind me. Back in the motel, the clerk handed me my key without a word. Same room, same creaky floor. I sat on the bed, staring at the cassette player I'd taken from the house. I hadn't meant to bring it, but there it was, sitting at the foot of my bed. I pressed play. Nothing at first. Then a woman's voice, calm, low. "They never scream. That's the trick. I stared at the recorder, the weight of that line sinking deeper than I expected. There had been no evidence of resistance, no indication of a fight, only a silence that settled into the walls, oppressive and absolute. A silence so deliberate, it felt like it had been placed there, not left behind. I replayed the voice in my mind, not because I wanted to hear it again, but because I needed to understand it. What kind of force makes terror quiet? Makes a victim disappear without even the decency of a sound? It wasn't a mere observation. It held intention, and it was meant for me. The tape clicked off. I didn't sleep. Instead, I reviewed my notes. My mind clung to patterns, desperately stitching threads between images and sounds and silences. My daughter's voice didn't belong in this town, in this chapel, on this tape. But it was here. That night, I dreamed of the chapel. But in the dream, it was inverted. Stairs going up turned downward. Doors led outside but opened into pitch black. At the altar stood someone in my coat, my stance, my face, but they were praying in a voice I'd never used. I woke up drenched in sweat. My mirror fogged over. I didn't look at it. Not then. Instead, I headed to the diner across from the station, coffee thick enough to pave roads. A woman there, hair white, eyes sharper than expected, asked, "Are you the detective?" I nodded. She leaned in. That girl didn't just die. She was emptied. Before I could speak, she stood and walked out. A breeze followed her. Inside, napkins fluttered like something had passed through more than air. I sat still, staring at the swinging door. The chill that followed her stayed in my chest longer than it should have. Who was she? How did she know about the girl? Why speak in riddles and then vanish into the wind? I spent the rest of the day in the motel, pretending to read through files while the cassette player sat silent on the table, its presence louder than any voice in the room. My mind wandered constantly to that voice, the tape, the chapel, the cold breath of something ancient pressing against my neck. I barely ate. Walked around the block twice, hoping fresh air would strip away the taste of unease from the back of my throat. It didn't. That night, sleep came in flickers, dreamless and light, and every noise outside my window pulled me halfway awake. The next morning came slower than usual, the sky refusing to brighten. I walked the same route to the diner, hands deep in my coat, eyes scanning the sidewalk for the old man from the Chapel Hill. No sign of him, just that dull, heavy fog sitting over everything. When I stepped inside, the warmth hit me hard, and there she was again, same stool, back straight, eyes forward. The next day, I found her again, sitting at the same stool. "Ma'am?" She turned, her eyes narrowing slightly, brows furrowed. "Do I know you? You told me about the victim yesterday. You said she didn't just die, you said she was emptied." Her expression shifted into something colder, more distant, as if she'd slammed a door I hadn't even seen. "I don't talk to strangers." "You knew her, didn't you?" I asked, voice low, trying not to scare the truth back into silence. "You saw something. You said—" "I said nothing," she cut in, too quickly. Her hands gripped the edge of the counter, knuckles whitening. "Whatever you think you heard, it wasn't from me. But it was you. Same seat, same voice." She shook her head, slowly. "Don't go chasing echoes, detective. Around here they chase back." Her words hung in the air, and something about the way she said them hit like a low-frequency tremor beneath the skin. I froze, notebook clenched in my hand, with a careful focus, assessing her behavior. What did she mean, exactly? They chase back, was she talking about voices? Memories? Or something that watches when you watch it? I replayed our exchange in my mind, looping over her phrasing, the shift in her eyes. She hadn't recognized me, or claimed not to, but there was knowledge in her posture, in how fast she shut down. Was it possible she'd seen what I had? Heard that same voice on a tape player? Or worse, had she heard voices that didn't need devices? If so, why deny it? Fear? Coercion? The detective in me pulled threads, Victim, chapel, rules, echoes, all scattered but circling the same dark center. All scattered but pointing inward, converging on something hidden in the center. But the father in me, the man who buried a daughter, he felt it in his ribs, the way a wound aches when pressure builds. Was this how it started for the last detective? Was this why no one tells the truth around here? And somewhere deeper, a question took root. If I was being watched, by what? I stepped outside. The chapel bell rang in the distance, soft but unwavering. My first instinct was to glance at my watch. It wasn't Sunday, it was Tuesday, mid-morning. But the bell tolled anyway, slow and solemn. I looked around, heads turned gently toward the sound, people pausing mid-step, mid-conversation. And then, silence. The silence didn't come from the bell, it came from the people. They fell quiet all at once, lips sealed, even the children still as statues. Not a sound passed between them, as if an invisible hand had turned the town's volume knob to 0. It was the rule. My hand hovered over the recorder in my coat, but I didn't move. I walked slowly down the sidewalk, letting my eyes do the work my voice couldn't. A woman froze at the corner with a grocery bag dangling from her fingers, unmoving. A man stood by his truck, keys in hand, staring into the fogged windshield. The entire town held its breath in that strange stillness, and no one looked confused, no surprise on their faces, just understanding. I obeyed the rule, kept my mouth shut. The bell kept ringing. When it stopped, the town resumed like someone pressed play on a paused reel. Conversations picked up mid-word. The woman kept walking. The man started his truck. No one acknowledged what had happened. I wanted to ask, needed to, but stayed silent. I held back, uncertain if the rule had truly ended, unsure if anyone else even noticed the line we had just crossed. Later, in my room, I played the chapel recording again. Clara's voice still there, but now it said something else. "Daddy, come see." I sat frozen, the sound of Clara's voice still echoing in my skull. My fingers curled around the edge of the bed as I tried to make sense of what I had just heard. This was no echo. It was too direct, too clear. It was her. Somehow. I looked at the cassette player. Nothing about its shape had changed, but I couldn't shake the sense that the air around it had shifted. Thicker, denser. It had become an extension of the chapel itself. She was gone. I had buried her. I had seen the casket lowered, stood in the cold, wet grass, and listened to the priest speak. Yet now she called me, not from memory, but from that building. That place wasn't abandoned. It wasn't just a relic. It was awake, and it had her voice. I stood slowly, body stiff, breath shallow. Whatever was in that chapel had reached out to me with intent. It wasn't trying to haunt me. It wanted something, and I knew I'd go back. Chapter 3. The Hollow Chapel. The morning came with a silence that felt earned. My body refused to move at first, like it remembered something my mind hadn't yet caught up to. The air in the motel room was heavier than before, denser, still. I sat up, the sheets creasing under me like old paper. The mirror above the dresser caught my eye. I remembered the way the mirror had looked the first time I arrived, like it had tried to smile and failed, the cracks curving at the edges like a grin interrupted. It wasn't just dirt, it was something else. Intentional. Watching. The glass was streaked in a way that looked almost deliberate, smudges shaped like fingers, long and spaced too far apart. I remembered one of the rules. Check your reflection every morning. If it blinks out of sync, stay in the room. I stood slowly and walked to the mirror, looked myself in the eye, waited. My breathing matched the fog on the glass. My reflection matched every movement. Almost. I blinked and stared into the mirror, expecting it to follow. But it didn't. My breath caught. My hands pressed flat against the dresser to keep myself grounded. I blinked again, fast, intentionally. The reflection followed. Relief washed in like a delayed wave, Whatever had happened, it wasn't happening now. But the warning clung to me. I stayed in the room longer than I should have, my mind spiraling around that moment of mismatch. The idea settled like dust. What if the victim hadn't noticed? What if her reflection had warned her? Maybe that's how she died, taken by something that mimicked more than just a voice. I left with a stiffness I couldn't shake. At the chapel, I paused before the steps. Morning fog pooled low, like the town didn't want me to see what was ahead. The wooden door gave a reluctant groan as it opened. The air inside was stale, filled with an artificial sweetness, flowers long dead but still fragrant. Inside, details came into focus that I'd missed from the doorway. Dust blanketed the pews in uneven patterns, as if someone had disturbed them recently and tried to set them back in place. Footprints, barely there, trailed through the central aisle, some small, some too narrow to belong to any adult I could picture. The stained glass windows filtered light in jagged shapes, coloring the floor with distorted reds and greens that pulsed as the clouds shifted outside. I stepped forward, each footfall careful. A lingering scent of burnt wax clung to the air, not fresh but unmistakable. Along the walls, candle holders held melted stubs, hardened in mid-drip. Something had been here not long ago, or was still here, watching from just beyond where the light reached. There was a presence here, not visible, but undeniable. I stepped up to the altar and set my cassette recorder down beside a warped Bible. I'd brought it with me, tight in my coat pocket the entire walk here. I took a slow breath, feeling the air grow colder as I adjusted the mic. Something small rested nearby, a fragment of cloth maybe, or a broken ribbon. I didn't touch it. Instead, I clicked the recorder on and hit record. The silence wasn't comforting. It pressed in, thick and expectant. I let the tape run for several minutes. My eyes moved across the room. Something new rested on the altar. A child's shoe, scuffed, familiar. When I hit stop and rewound the tape, the hiss of static filled the air. First came footsteps, not mine. A low hum followed, close and steady, like a breath too near. And then a voice. "Don't look at her. She isn't yours." The voice was male, too calm given the content of the message. Not a warning, a directive, and one who knew more than I did. "She isn't yours." The words turned in my mind like a rusted key. Was it trying to protect me or mark a boundary? If it wasn't Clara, if it was only something wearing her, who did it belong to? Had someone before me tried to claim her? Had someone failed? That voice hadn't been on the tape yesterday, which meant it had waited. Or worse, it had watched. The bell might have triggered the recording, sure, but that explanation felt thin, convenient. This was no longer about lingering sounds or trapped memories. Something conscious had responded to my presence, knowing I would hear it and daring me to act. I stepped away from the altar and let my gaze drift along the edges of the chapel. As I neared the pulpit, my boots tapped a different note against the floor, hollow, irregular. I crouched, pressing my fingers to the wood. It shifted under light pressure. Something was beneath. Carefully, I pulled up a board. Damp air rose to meet me. Below was a layer of fresh, unsettled earth. It hadn't been there long. I didn't dig. There was enough in that stillness to suggest I shouldn't. My eyes scanned nearby, and that's when I spotted it. A scrap of notebook paper barely peeking out from beneath the podium's base. I reached for it and froze. It was my handwriting. The slant, the pressure, the ink, even the slight flourish on the letter D. Don't follow her. The words weren't familiar. I hadn't written them, at least not in this place, not at this time. I turned the page over, but it was blank. There was no date and no signature, only those 3 words that echoed louder than any name could. A warning from myself or something pretending to be me. The air shifted and my skin tightened with unease. I stood, breath caught in my throat, scanning the chapel. It looked the same, but something was different. That was when I saw her. Near the last pew, a figure stood, completely still and eerily silent. Clara's shape, her dress, the one she wore that last day. She faced away from me, hair still, body still. I took a step. She didn't move. Another. "Clara?" The figure turned slowly, and a sudden chill seized my lungs. The face wore Clara's features, but they were wrong in ways that made my skin crawl. The eyes were vacant, stretched unnaturally wide, as if it was trying to mimic surprise but didn't understand what it meant. The mouth twisted into a smile, one that belonged on no child's face, least of all hers. I stepped back, heart pounding. It copied me, every weight shift, every retreating step. When I turned slightly, it mirrored the motion exactly, like a reflection not in glass but in thought. It was playing a role it had rehearsed too many times. I felt the edges of panic curl around my ribs. What stood before me wasn't just an eerie sight. It was an entity that studied me, mimicking familiarity with unnerving precision, attempting to decode my grief and wear it like a costume. Something that had studied grief, mimicked love, and wore my daughter's last memory like a mask. I bolted, not with logic, but instinct, the chapel's wooden floor groaning beneath me as I ran through the aisle and pushed into the open air. Outside, the fog had grown impossibly dense, curling around the chapel like a living thing. The church bell rang again, the sound sharp and too clean, like it didn't belong in this world. From the corners of the fog, voices stirred. Some murmured, some hissed, all distant yet deeply personal. My breath came out in ragged clouds as I sprinted back toward the motel, unsure if I was being followed or if something had already arrived ahead of me. Back at the motel, I slammed the door behind me. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I checked the mirror. My reflection blinked. So did I. And for now, it was safe. I sat on the floor, back to the bed, recorder in hand, replaying the voice. That warning, that shape. The girl might have seen it. She could have followed, thinking it was someone familiar. Perhaps the reflection had tried to warn her, a silent message too subtle or too strange to interpret. Maybe she simply looked away at the wrong moment, or maybe she never had a chance to understand what she was seeing. And maybe now, it wanted me instead. I spent hours piecing things together. The girl wasn't just murdered, she was taken, emptied, her image used, her voice was stored. I remembered the woman's words in the diner. I remembered the mirror. I remembered my daughter's voice, calling out in a way that felt deliberate, almost like it had a destination. I wondered if the rules weren't just warnings, but the last lines of defense, rituals to keep something from breaking through. When I played the tape again, it skipped to a part I hadn't recorded. My own voice whispered, "She's waiting." My heart went cold. The mimic was learning. It had more than her face now. I needed to understand the town. The only person who might give me something real was the sheriff. I found him standing outside his truck later that afternoon, staring at the chapel like it had just spoken. I ran into the sheriff later, outside the diner where the fog seemed thinner, less intrusive. He stood with a paper cup of coffee in hand, staring into nothing. I approached cautiously, the morning's events still sitting in my chest like a stone. "The chapel's older than most of the buildings here," I started. "What do you know about it?" His expression tightened. He didn't answer right away. "They used to marry people there," he said eventually. "Back when the town had laughter. Haven't heard a bell ring for anything good in decades." I waited. The pause between us felt like a test. There's talk that it was built over something that was never meant to be touched. Before we had maps, before we had names. Some say there's still a body under the pulpit, one that doesn't stay still. We keep it quiet. That's how it stays quiet. I asked about the last detective, the one before me. "Didn't finish the case," he muttered. "Went into the woods one night, said he heard something calling him near the chapel. Never came back. All we found was his coat. You're sleeping in his room." Before I could say more, he tipped his hat and crossed the street, fading into the town's slow rhythm. I watched him disappear, but my thoughts didn't follow. It was the chapel then. Whatever its history, whatever it was built over, it had a pull. Enough to lure a trained man into the trees, enough to hollow him out. The body under the pulpit, the voice on my recorder, the figure in Clara's dress, each thread unraveling back to that one place. Maybe I was already walking the same path. Maybe it had already chosen me. Later, back in the motel, I sat at the edge of the bed with the recorder beside me, the weight of the chapel still pressing against my chest. The voice on the tape lingered, the warning repeating like a breath I couldn't release. I reached for the files again, hoping for a missing thread, something I'd overlooked. But all I had were fragmented reports and vague timelines. Nothing solid, nothing that could tell me why a place like that existed or why it had chosen this town. The chapel had pulled in the last detective. It was pulling me now, and if I didn't move carefully, it wouldn't just take the case, it would take me. I needed more evidence, not just to solve the murder. I needed to understand the rules, the chapel, the patterns. I needed to know what had happened to that girl and what that thing had done with her shape. All while making sure I didn't lose my mind or whatever else it was trying to claim. And somehow, I needed to survive long enough to finish what the last man started. The morning sun was a pale smear through the curtains, weak and indifferent. I hadn't slept. The motel room held the weight of things unspoken, as though the air had thickened with everything I didn't want to admit. The recorder sat on the nightstand, unmoved since last night, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Not yet. Instead, I sat with a folded map of the area, tracing the tree line northwest of the chapel with my finger. No one had told me to go there, but something in the case file had pushed me to consider the woods. A pattern, maybe. A void in the records. A missing piece waiting to be filled. I couldn't shake the thought that whatever answers I needed wouldn't be found in town. They'd be buried out there. I didn't know what I was hoping to find, maybe a trace of the truth or a mistake in the mimicry, but deep down I wanted to know what had happened to the detective who came before me. If there were connections to the murdered girl's case, I needed to see them for myself. I packed water, a flashlight, and the camera from the glove box. If there was something to find, I'd need proof. The walk to the forest's edge was longer and more disorienting than I had anticipated. A thin trail snaked through thickets and fields choked with weeds. Fences long since collapsed, sprawled like tired sentinels, their posts rotting where they met the ground. At intervals, I stumbled upon half-buried items, a rusted kettle, the frame of an old chair, tools that hadn't been held in decades. The forgotten fragments of lives once lived here made the silence more pronounced, as if those who had left them behind had never really gone. The wind had a muting quality, carrying the soft shush of branches with the gentleness of a lullaby. But beneath it was a hum, like the low throb of something buried deep. The trail narrowed near the tree line, where the forest stood close and watchful. Each step forward drew a curtain behind me. By the time I crossed the first line of trees, the light had already dimmed. The canopy above knitted together like clasped hands. The quiet inside wasn't peace, it was containment. And I'd stepped straight into it. I kept moving, boots brushing moss, every branch above casting web-like shadows. The path narrowed near a slope where stones jutted like broken bones from the earth. There, caught in a tangle of roots, I spotted a torn strip of fabric. I tugged it free, navy blue, with a brass button hanging by a thread. Near it, something glinted in the dirt. A badge, dulled and worn, initials still legible. R.D. Robert Danning. My pulse quickened. I turned on the camera and took a photo. The forest didn't react. Not yet. Driven by something heavier than curiosity, I kept going. The earth shifted beneath me, rising toward a knoll wrapped in silence. At the top, I found a depression in the soil. It had settled long ago, yet signs of disturbance lingered. I dropped to my knees and brushed the surface with trembling hands. The dirt gave way. Fingers first, cold, then the sleeve of a jacket and the curve of a shoulder. I uncovered the face slowly, afraid of what I'd see. He hadn't escaped. He hadn't disappeared. He had been buried, hidden like a mistake no one wanted to remember. His skin was drawn tight over bone, eyes shut, mouth open slightly. There was a kind of stillness to him, as if he'd known this was where he'd end up. I stood and took a hesitant step back, heart pounding in my throat. My fingers trembled slightly as I raised the camera, the cold metal unfamiliar in my hands despite its recent use. One photo. It showed what I expected. Hollow cheeks, a dark bruise curling at the temple. I reviewed the image again. His eyes were open, staring directly at me. I blinked, looked again. The photo had changed back. Eyes closed, peaceful. But the dread remained, coiled in my gut. The rule echoed like a whisper. Do not trust photographs. I held the camera tighter, the weight of it suddenly immense. And still I knew. I had to keep going. I took a breath and moved to examine the area further, hoping to find more belongings or signs of struggle. Instead, near the disturbed soil, I found a torn notebook. The cover had rotted at the edges, but the spine held. Inside were pages filled with messy handwriting, his observations, details of the case, descriptions of locals, even the chapel. But the last entry was different. She came again last night. This time she didn't smile. She asked for him by name. I think she knows I'm watching. I think he doesn't want her to leave. I stared at that final line. The implication stirred something deep in my chest. Whoever he was, he wasn't finished. And she, whoever or whatever had been mimicking Clara, was still being watched, possibly controlled. The forest released me reluctantly. As I stepped back through the curtain of trees, I could feel its watchful presence lingering just behind me. Each step away from the burial site carried a weight I hadn't felt before, a mixture of guilt and urgency. The trail looked different now, as if the forest had shifted slightly while I was inside. Branches leaned in closer and the sky had darkened, even though it was barely afternoon. I made my way through the fields, past the same forgotten tools and sagging fences, but everything felt changed. My mind spun with what I'd seen and with what the camera had shown me. I replayed the moment in my head, over and over. The photograph, the eyes. I couldn't shake the image. The closer I got to town, the more each familiar landmark felt surreal. The rusted sign welcoming visitors to the town square looked older than it had that morning, its letters dulled and nearly unreadable. Still, I kept walking, needing some kind of anchor. When I reached Main Street, I stopped by the small general store. The clerk barely looked up as I passed the register. Inside, the place smelled like old wood and soap. I moved toward the back, past shelves of canned goods and postcards. In a plastic crate marked clearance, I found old newspapers folded and yellowed. One headline stood out. Local detective goes missing near chapel. Third case in 10 years. There was a photo of the building, smaller, more intact. And beneath it, a note scribbled in pen. She walks twice. I brought the paper to the counter. The clerk, a man with tired eyes and a permanent frown, didn't look up. "You back again already?" he asked. I froze. "Sorry?" He nodded toward the door. "You were just here 10 minutes ago. Bought aspirin and a bottle of water. You all right?" I hadn't been there. I had only just arrived. A slow unease crept up my spine. My hand instinctively reached for the newspaper. The rule echoed again. If someone claimed they saw you when you know you weren't present, you needed to walk away. I didn't argue. I paid for the paper, turned, and left without another word. But as I stepped outside, the clerk's words replayed in my mind. "You were just here, 10 minutes ago." The way he said it, without doubt or hesitation, burrowed deep. Was it a mistake? A trick of memory? Or had something taken my place, walked in my skin, said my name? My breath came slower, each one more deliberate. If he saw me, and I know I wasn't there, then who had he seen? And what else had it done pretending to be me? Outside, I sat on a bench near the edge of the square and read the article. It didn't give me anything new, just repetition of facts, strange disappearances, and townsfolk unwilling to talk. But that note, "She walks twice," haunted me. Was it a reference to her appearance? Was it literal? Could the mimic have split forms, one you could see and one you only remembered? That evening, I returned to the motel and set the recorder by the lamp. I hadn't touched it all day. I didn't remember turning it on, but the small red light blinked steadily. Curious and unsettled, I pressed play. The hiss of the tape filled the room, followed by a long, expectant silence. Then came the sound of breathing. My breathing. Slow and heavy, each inhale like the dragging of a chain, as if I were asleep. There was a rustle, the faint creak of bed springs shifting beneath an unseen weight. Then I heard it. My own voice, low, groggy, and whispering. I shouldn't have brought you here. This place became my curse. I froze, mouth dry, heart stuttering inside my chest. The words weren't unfamiliar, but I hadn't spoken them in years. Not since before her funeral, certainly not last night, and not into the recorder that had quietly captured every second without my knowledge. I replayed it, listened again, trying to find a break, a tell that this was fake, but there was none. It wasn't merely speech, it carried the weight of a confession, a weight I didn't know I still carried, stitched into each syllable like regret pressed into old letters. My thoughts raced. That voice, those words, they weren't meant for the tape, they were meant for her, my daughter. And as the truth uncoiled inside me, a different realization took hold. Some part of me had come here hoping to find peace. Another part had come to deliver something. Maybe to her, maybe to myself. Maybe this place didn't curse me. Maybe I brought the curse with me. The recorder clicked off. I hadn't realized how long I'd been sitting there. Sweat clung to the back of my neck, and the motel room suddenly felt too small, too loud in its silence. I slipped the device back into the drawer, careful not to brush the buttons. Not again. Not tonight. Later that night, I found myself unable to sleep. The silence outside pressed against the windows like a held breath. I stood by the glass, the cold pain grounding me as I stared out into the distance. The chapel sat hunched in the dark, a silhouette that no longer felt passive. Something about its shape, its placement, and its imposing stillness demanded attention. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than a building, that it held something back, or in. Morning brought little clarity. With tired eyes and a stale mind, I ventured out into town. My questions were vague, my tone casual. I asked about the history of the church, if anyone remembered the original blueprints, the renovations, each group. The people I approached turned rigid. Their conversations stopped mid-sentence. Smiles faded into wary glances. No one answered directly, but I caught their quick, sharp, and evasive glances, and always, they shifted their stance slightly, like they wanted to turn away. It wasn't silence by ignorance, it was silence by choice. Frustrated and no closer to the truth, I found my steps guiding me toward the chapel. The streets grew emptier as I walked, and when I reached the edge of the square, I spotted movement, shapes emerging behind the chapel, a procession too quiet for midday. I dropped low behind a trash bin across the street, breath shallow, and watched. 5 or 6 figures moved with eerie coordination, their pace unhurried, their eyes empty, like puppets, half asleep. They didn't speak. They didn't acknowledge one another. They just moved, slipping behind the church like water into a drain. When they were gone, I crossed quickly. Heart in my throat, I followed the direction they had come from. Grass flattened beneath my feet led me around the rear of the chapel, and that's when I saw it. A break in the stone wall, an old wooden hatch nearly swallowed by ivy. It had been recently disturbed. I crouched, placing my hand on the wood. It was cool, slightly damp, the kind of cold that didn't belong to surface air. I leaned in. The faintest breath of earth, stale and undisturbed, drifted upward. There was something beneath, and I was going to find out what. The hatch resisted at first, as if the earth itself had grown tired of yielding secrets. But I pressed on, hand straining against the swollen wood until it groaned open with a sound like breath after drowning. The scent hit me immediately. Damp soil, mildew, and something metallic underneath. like old blood that had never been washed away. I descended the narrow ladder, each rung slick and trembling beneath my weight. The trapdoor creaked shut above me, and for a moment, there was only blackness. Then the darkness softened, not with light, but with awareness. The kind of awareness that isn't yours, not entirely. I clicked on my flashlight. Its beam cut a thin, pale line down the stone corridor stretching ahead. The walls were crude and narrow, close enough to brush my shoulders. Cold sweat formed along my neck. This place wasn't just a cellar. It felt ancient, ceremonial. The stones bore shallow grooves, clearly worn by countless hands over the years. Hands moved by habit, by fear, by belief, and repeated, reverent, desperate hands. I moved forward, drawn forward by a sense of inevitability that had been with me since the moment I accepted this case, perhaps even earlier. My boots echoed softly with each step. The silence seemed to vibrate with something just out of reach, filled with anticipation. I passed alcoves carved into the walls, each housing broken remnants of ceremony, chalices, crumbling books, wax figures half melted and fused to the stone. Then I saw them, the murals, crude at first, little more than stick figures in red ochre, but they evolved as I moved deeper, gaining detail, shape, and story. One panel showed people gathered in worship. Another, a figure arriving, a shape with no face, merely a blank oval surrounded by drawn lines like hair. The next mural chilled me. It depicted the figure touching one of the villagers. The touched person split in two. The original fell limp, while the other remained upright, unchanged, now with a blank face. A mimic. The story continued. Those duplicated continued to walk among the villagers. Unnoticed at first, eventually revered, and finally feared. One panel stopped me cold. It showed a young girl on her knees, her face twisted in horror. Behind her loomed the mimic, vague in form but eerily familiar. The girl's eyes were wide, her mouth agape. And beside her, a man, wild-eyed, scribbling frantically into a book. Robert Danning, perhaps. I stared at the mural and the pattern began to emerge. This was more than a depiction of rites. It was a historical record. The mimic's presence wasn't a recent phenomenon. The girl, the victim I'd come to investigate, had suffered the same fate. Danning had seen it, tried to document it, and in doing so, he had lost his grasp on reality. Her terror now made sense. The inconsistencies in the reports, the strange symbols, the obsessive notations, it all pointed to repetition. The mimic had infiltrated before. It had stolen lives and replaced them with lies. Danning didn't intervene. He became a witness, a chronicler overwhelmed by the horror. The next mural dissolved into madness. A man fleeing into the woods, his features distorted, eyes hollow, mouth stretched in a silent scream. He had uncovered too much, and it had broken him. I backed away from the wall, heart racing. The edges of my vision pulsed. I needed to get out. A flicker in the darkness caught my eye. From the shadowed corner of the chamber, Clara emerged. Her small frame was dimly lit by the beam of my flashlight, which trembled ever so slightly in my grip. She looked just like I remembered, with tearful eyes and that nervous twist of her fingers when she was afraid. Her lips quivered, and when she spoke, it was barely more than a whisper. "Dad? Dad, is that you?" I froze. My breath caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed illusion, hallucination, but she kept speaking, her voice breaking, the sound so achingly familiar it rattled my ribs. She stepped forward slowly, her movements hesitant. "I was so cold. You said it'd be quiet, but it's so dark down here. Why didn't you come back for me?" Tears streamed down her cheeks, and my body moved before my mind could catch up. I reached out but stopped. Something was off. She hugged the stuffed lion tightly, her voice quivering. "Mr. Snips missed you so much," she said. My stomach twisted. I stepped closer, studying the worn plush. "What did you call him?" I asked. She looked up, confused. "Mr. Snips, why?" My throat went dry. Clara never called her toy that. Ever. It had always been buttons since she was 3. It was the one thing she never got wrong, not even in sleep. Doubt seeped in like cold water through a cracked window. Everything else, her voice, her tears, her fear, it had all been right. But this was the crack in the mask. I knew then. Clara never called it that. Never. My chest tightened. My daughter's eyes searched mine with perfect practiced innocence, and yet, the mimic had studied her, replicated every habit, but it hadn't known everything. A chill deeper than any I had ever known slid down my spine. My heart broke and recoiled at once. She wasn't real, but she was close enough to break me. "You found them," she said, her voice as light as breath and just as sharp. My throat closed, words dammed behind a flood of understanding I didn't want. She stepped forward, calm, composed. "You shouldn't have come alone," I managed a whisper. "I didn't. Bring anyone." Her smile flickered, a ghost's smirk. "But you did. You brought her, and you left her. Right here." The murals behind me seemed to watch, the mimic's blank face, the girl's horror, Danning's madness, and now mine. Fragments reassembled in my head, jagged and unstoppable. A night years ago, a raincoat, my trembling hands and a patch of damp soil beneath a chapel that no one visited. I had been here, not as a detective, as a grieving father, with a lifeless girl I loved more than breath. I buried her, I confessed, voice hollow. I thought she'd be safe here, quiet, at peace. The thing wearing Clara's skin tilted her head. "And you left," thinking that would be enough. But he found her, and he found you, the mimic, the curse, the reason the town had closed its eyes, the reason I had returned. I stared into those borrowed eyes, and what stared back was no rage or menace, just something deeper, something far more unsettling. Understanding. Images unfurled in my mind with merciless clarity. I saw myself, kneeling in the rain-drenched soil, dirt caking my hands and clothes, whispering broken apologies to a small, lifeless body wrapped in a blue raincoat, her raincoat. My fingers trembled as I smoothed the earth, telling myself she'd be safe, that this place was far from everything and everyone. Then came the memory of me walking back to town, my steps hollow, my mind numb. I'd told myself I needed to keep going, that the case had chosen me. But I now saw it clearly. The case, the murder, the mimic. It had always been the same thread winding through grief and denial, a loop not yet broken. "You're not her," I said. "No," she agreed, eyes softening. "But I was, for a moment, just long enough." She stepped closer, and I stumbled back, colliding with the mural. Her eyes shimmered with something. Pity? She screamed, the real one, the victim. Not because she saw me, but because she saw you. She thought you were part of it. "I wasn't," I choked out. "But you were," she whispered. I collapsed into the cold stone, the echo of her voice still hanging in the thick air, impossible to scrub from my mind. The weight of what I'd uncovered wasn't just horror, it was guilt, ancient and personal. I had brought her here, thinking I was giving her peace, and instead I'd fed her to something that mimicked the face I loved most. My hands trembled as I pressed them to my face. I had seen madness in Danning's eyes. I had seen terror in the mural, and now I felt both clinging to me like the damp air that coated this tomb. The world deserved to know. Someone needed to understand what was down here, what we buried and called sacred. But how could I speak of this? How could I tell the truth when every thread led back to my hands? If I were the one who opened the door, if I gave it the form it needed, if I led others into its reach, was I any less culpable than the thing itself? My mouth stayed shut, not because I didn't want to scream, but because I no longer knew if I deserved to be heard. I ran. The tunnel curved violently, the walls shrinking, pressing. I found the ladder, climbed, pushed. The hatch wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Behind me, her voice again. "You brought the curse, not me." And then silence. Only my own breath, only my own memories. The mimic didn't need to chase me, it had already won, and all I could do was remember. The passage groaned shut behind me, swallowing the last trace of daylight. My legs buckled from the strain. My mind buckled from the truth. The mimic had worn Clara's face. It had wrapped itself in her voice, her trembling hands, the way she whispered my name when scared. And I had believed. For a moment, I had believed. I sat in the darkness, breath shallow, body numb. That voice still rang in my ears. Come, let's become one and end this. Let's find peace together, Dad. It stepped closer, the mimic in Clara's form reaching toward me. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but something in her eyes held me still. It wasn't love, nor was it malice. It was something harder to name, a lure woven from familiarity and emptiness, a promise of rest, an invitation to surrender. You're tired, she said. So tired. Just let go. It won't hurt. Not like remembering. Her voice deepened slightly, resonance shifting, a growl blooming beneath her gentle tone. Her form began to ripple, Clara's features warping, her limbs elongating, her eyes darkening into obsidian voids. She was shedding the disguise, revealing what had always been beneath. The real mimic was coming through, a clawed hand stretched toward me. Let me in, and all of this ends. Just as she lunged, a crash erupted above. The door burst open, flooding the chamber with harsh light. Boots pounded down the ladder, fast and forceful. Atkins! Move! The sheriff's voice was a gunshot. He hauled me up the ladder by my collar. The mimic screeched behind us, a sound like wind through broken teeth. As the hatch slammed shut, I collapsed onto the chapel floor. The sheriff didn't speak right away. He led me back to his office, one hand on my shoulder, steady but firm. The walk was silent, except for the sound of my boots scraping against the chapel's old stone floor. Once inside, he shut the door behind us, locking it as if to keep the horrors outside. I slumped into a chair, my limbs still trembling. He knelt in front of me, eyes searching mine, voice low but insistent. I saw you, he said, disbelief heavy in every word. I saw you standing near the woods just an hour ago. I called your name, asked you a few questions, and you, his voice cracked slightly. You didn't answer. You just stared at me, Gordon, cold, like you didn't recognize me at all. His grip tightened. It wasn't right. Something in your eyes. I knew something was off, so I followed you. Or rather, I followed what I thought was you. I kept my distance, watching as you, or it, moved along the forest edge, silent, not quite right. Then something caught my eye back near the chapel. A part of the wall I'd never noticed before, a faint line like a seam. Call it luck or instinct, but I decided to check it out. The trail I was following vanished, and I figured if I'd been wrong, I'd be back in a minute. Instead, I found the entrance, and then I heard you. The real you. His voice trembled with a mix of fear and relief, grounding the terror I hadn't yet found words for. I tried to respond, but my voice dissolved into sobs. The girl, I gasped. Where's the victim buried? He blinked. No family. Put her in the potter's field, the old cemetery, edge of town. It took me a while to regain the strength to rise. My legs trembled as I stepped outside the sheriff's office, the midday heat pressing down like a weight. I searched the tool shed, fingers brushing past rusted tools until I gripped a shovel. My hands, still trembling, felt steadier with purpose. I walked slowly, the streets of the town eerily quiet. Windows were shut, curtains drawn. The silence was unnatural, like the town was holding its breath. By the time I reached the cemetery gates, the sun had dipped behind thick clouds. The old potter's field spread out before me, wild and unkempt. Grass brushed my knees, and the stones stood like crooked teeth. I wandered between them, reading names faded with time until I found hers. I stood over the grave for a long time. Part of me hoped the sheriff had been wrong, that I'd find nothing. But I began to dig. With every shovelful of earth, the ache in my body deepened. My breath grew ragged, and my shirt clung to me with sweat. When the shovel struck wood, a chill passed through me. Kneeling, I wiped the dirt away. My fingers slipped beneath the lid and pried it open. What I saw was no longer her. Her features had melted into a grotesque mask. The bones were bent, reshaped, wrong in a way that hurt to look at. It was the same corruption I'd seen before, in Danning, the same fate. I fell back, shaking. The sight was grotesque and revealing in equal measure. I had come hoping to find closure, but what I found unraveled something deeper. The mimic didn't just replace the living, it consumed them, warped them, erased their final dignity. Clara, when I buried her here, I thought I was laying her to rest. But what if that moment, that very act, had given the mimic what it needed? What if her death wasn't just a loss, but a doorway? I thought I'd find peace. Instead, I found a curse that fed even on the dead, leaving nothing behind but twisted echoes. After a moment of stillness, I made my way back to the sheriff's office, questions swirling too loud to ignore. I found him seated behind his desk, going over notes. Without preamble, I asked, "Where exactly did you see me?" He looked up, a shadow crossing his expression. "Old Forest Road," he said slowly. "You were headed in, alone." That answer clenched something in my chest. I stepped outside, and the late afternoon sun filtered weakly through clouds. The trees in the distance loomed darker than before, as if they'd been waiting. I reached the Old Forest Road, gravel crunching beneath my boots. The further I walked, the narrower the path became, branches clawing at my coat. The quiet deepened, broken only by my breath. Then it hit me, the smell. That unmistakable rot from beneath the chapel, earthy and acidic. I slowed. Shadows moved strangely between the trunks. The leaves didn't rustle right. Then, through the trees, I saw him, me, crouched by a gas can, lighter in hand. His posture was mine, down to the curve of his shoulders. When he turned, I met my own eyes. The same scar above the brow, the same exhaustion. He didn't flinch. He smiled, lit the flame. He began to unravel. He didn't burn or tear, but simply dissolved. Like cloth separating at the seams, every strand loosened until there was nothing left to recognize. It resembled no natural death. It was precise, intentional. The mimic was removing traces as if it knew its end had come. I stood still, silence thick around me. Slowly, I moved forward, each step heavy until I reached the spot where I had stood. The soil retained warmth. My hands, streaked with dirt and unsteady, started to dig. I had once buried Clara. Now it was time to bury myself. The grave took shape slowly, shaped by regret and need. When it was ready, I laid down the remains. I didn't bury it out of obligation. I buried it seeking forgiveness. It was more than a discarded form left by the mimic. It symbolized everything I had failed to protect, every choice that haunted me. When the last clump of earth was in place, the thought echoed in my mind, unspoken yet deafening. Some things are meant to stay buried.